So in 1999-2000, we invested in this company. In 2005, they came back to me and said, well, okay, the company's broke, but we still think we should put more money into it. Write another big check, put more money. After 08, it's broke again. All right, we'll write another check. Company goes public, and now it's the largest automaker in capitalization side in the world, Tesla. But now I have to ask myself, is that still a sustainable company?
Today, I'm excited to bring you a different kind of episode than what we've done before as the SRI 360 podcast approaches its second anniversary. We've created a best of episode, and I've curated some of the best and some of my favorite and most insightful and engaging moments from our past interviews. Those of you who are familiar with the podcast know that at the end of each episode, I usually conclude by asking my guests 5 rapid-fire questions. One of the most popular questions is, you don't have to name names, but describe for me an investment that you were convinced of at the time you invested that it ticked all of your financial and sustainability and impact boxes, but in the end it didn't turn out, and what were the lessons learned from that experience. In this special episode, you'll hear some of the most compelling brief answers to this question, offering a wealth of what I call short lessons learned from some world-class investors in sustainable and responsible investing. I encourage you to enjoy these stories and short lessons from investors at both large, well-known firms as well as those from lesser-known shops that I consider as stars who are leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. All of these impressive individuals have played a significant role in transforming responsible investing, and you can find the bios of each of these guests and links to their full interview in the show notes. Please enjoy, and thank you for listening. Can you describe to me an example of an investment that you were convinced of at the time you invested that it ticked all of your SRI ESG boxes, but in the end it didn't turn out, and what did you learn from that experience?
So there was one bank in India issued a green bond, which we bought in our portfolios. End of last year, we learned that they were about to finance the biggest open pit coal mine in the world in Australia.
Oh, gosh.
And then we just downgraded them to non-green, sold it out from our portfolios. I think, the one thing we really learned from this is that emerging markets is a different world than developed markets in terms of transparency and credibility for sustainable finance. They're way behind.
Living through one right now, where the fund we invested in provided small business loans across the African continent, but they didn't have people in those communities. What they were relying on is the efficiency of technology to help get the right economies of scale, the right economics, to make the fund work economically and to get capital into the hands of people. And it didn't work. It is relationship lending. And so the economic model never penciled out. They needed to put people in places, and that cost more than they ever thought. So this idea that small business lending can all be digitized, I now have great skepticism about.
When I didn't fully appreciate the cost side, so a good example of one that didn't make it was, and this is again not anywhere near the sustainability field, but it was in the clothing rental business. So you have something called Rent the Runway, which is, you can rent fashion gowns instead of having to pay for it. And it's been very successful, a unicorn company. So members of that company went into the bridesmaids dresses rental business. If you ask any young woman when they're at that stage of their life, when they get the phone call from their best friend that says we'd be a bridesmaid and you have to buy the dress, you think, oh gosh, here we go, another dress I'll never use, stick it in the closet. And when you're at that certain age when all your friends are getting married, you might get 5 of those calls. So this idea of using the Rent the Runway theme for bridesmaids dresses, if you ask any young woman, oh, what a brilliant idea. That's exactly what I said, what a brilliant idea. What I didn't focus on was the inventory requirement for that business versus Rent the Runway. Rent the Runway is one size, it doesn't matter. In this instance, you had to have 5 or 6 of every dress in every color and every size in order to meet the bridal party need. And then the ability to reuse, typically people get a little fast and loose with everything. Rip it and whatever. And you looked at the inventory cost of maintaining what you needed to do to serve the client was a complete bust model versus the business it was born out of. And even though it was wildly successful on the surface, the company went into administration. They never made it because the cost infrastructure, the more successful they were, the more money they lost.
A great example was, I remember early in my career having investments in a bond which was linked to the company Enron that blew up in 2001, right? I had a bond called Yosemite Finance. It was a short-dated bond. It was AAA rated. I trusted in the credit rating, thought it was going to be fine, and it ended up being worth nothing, and having to explain to clients why they now had a hole in their portfolio was not a fun experience at all. And I think what that obviously was an example of was corporate fraud. But I think the other thing that sort of interests me is, again, having a robust ESG framework is something that helps you identify something like corporate fraud. I would like to think that actually having that framework, it meant that when we looked at an issuer like Wirecard a couple of years ago, it sent up all sorts of red flags. We gave it a really shocking ESG score, and before we looked any further at it, we'd already eliminated it as an issuer that we'd invest in, kind of thing. So that was an example of how, again, you're learning your lessons and trying to look for signals of fraudulent behaviour and incorporate that in terms of a governance framework.
Dependent on people to execute. And humans have flaws. You could end up with what seems like a good model and certainly very committed individuals, but you're highly dependent on that group of individuals to execute. If the execution is flawed, and that doesn't mean they were bad people, it just means they didn't have the right skill set to get the job done. And so the other piece of advice we always learn is that encourage them to go ahead and feel comfortable that they can pivot and experiment with changing the model. Not working, and it's not going to work. We've demonstrated that it doesn't work.
I had owned NMC, the healthcare company. It's a healthcare company at that time prior to its fraud. It's an Indian-based company. They had a almost 3-decade exposure, high credibility and recognition in the Middle East. This is a bit of the challenge, is that still with all the governance and all the looking and the work that I had done, in a lot of issuers in emerging markets, it's all about governance. And it's a hard nut. Particularly in that region, most of these issuers tend to get very close ties and family ties to the government. And so there's a lot of sort of backdoor relationships. And that's why 80% of my trades I do with locals, because I want this kind of backdoor knowledge. Clearly that fraud, I was able to navigate out of those positions. And I ended up losing about 4% net. I got lucky.
It was actually a high-risk investment, but in that eco products fund that I raised and managed, the first U.S. fund, we did a biobank. It was called the Malua Biobank, M-A-L-U-A, Malua Biobank in Sabah, Malaysia. And essentially we were trying to monetize the biodiversity value of this incredible rainforest in Sabah and sell these kind of biodiversity conservation certificates. So it's essentially like a voluntary biobank, and we wanted to sell the biodiversity value into kind of the oil palm supply chain. Yeah. And it was very well structured as an investment, as an asset. But the demand, of course, was like completely untested. And we spent years and a lot of social capital with the government of Sabah. And it ultimately wasn't successful as an investment. But we learned so much about taking a risk, how the challenges with voluntary demand, but how to structure kind of these innovative investments. But frankly, in some ways, we were just 10 years ahead of our time. You were talking about the question about technology. Yeah, there's plenty of people who are trying to do that now. Like they're trying to tokenize biodiversity. They're looking at new ways of kind of financing these kind of biodiversity conservation projects. So I can go, okay, we were ahead of our time, but the structure was actually fundamentally sound. And if we were doing that now with the technology that we've got now and in the context now of what people are valuing, maybe it would have been successful investment. So I don't know if I answered your question exactly the way you wanted me to answer it, but that's probably what.
So the thing that always surprises me is that, and this has happened in a few of our deals, that although in success, management and the executive team thrives, if something goes south and the pressure on, there are certain entrepreneurs, there are certain businesses that are able to face it and overcome it. And then there's certain people that just go down. And so what we have learned is that those, I think in business school, they call it the Icarus paradox. So you get too close to the sun, the whole like ego thing. Yeah. So I think that we have learned that first, we need very strong working relationships and partnerships. So that's why we have that high touch involvement. And second is that we have to really know that there's going to be listening, learning, pivoting, adapting, and at times there isn't. And when that's the case, then there's nothing you could do to rescue the business.
So in 1999, 2000, we invested in this company. In 2005, they came back to me and said, well, okay, the company's broke, but we still think we should put more money into it because it's probably going to make money someday. Okay, write another big check, put more money. After 08, it's broke again. Then I said, are we throwing good money after bad? And they said, well, we don't think they'll ever make their final product, but we're pretty darn sure we're going to make a ton of money on the patents. The patents look really good. All right, we'll write another check. Company goes public. And now it's the largest automaker in capitalization side in the world, Tesla. But now I have to ask myself, is that still a sustainable company? Are those lithium batteries sustainable? Is the employment practices of that company sustainable? I don't know.
Biggest lesson in regards to investment, I'm not sure whether all the impact boxes were ticked in the same way as today but it's one of the set of projects that hedge fund RKB invested in was in Russian pipeline projects. And back then it was 2006. It was a completely political environment, but ultimately we invested in these. And actually from a technical perspective, these projects were wonderful because they were very easy. We basically measured the emissions on pipelines, took out the valves, fixed them with Gore-Tex, and close them, and there was a massive emission reduction. What we failed to basically fully appreciate is that the Russian government back then was not really willing to participate in the UN mechanism, and while we had contractual obligations that secured us, and while we had even insurance, what I learned is, I was no longer working, that it took 7 to 8 years for the fund to enforce all its right and to get at least a large portion of their money back. So that was a huge lesson for me, and I kind of followed it initially from doing the project and then helped them to go through the entire kind of process with international arbitration and insurance tribunal to get the money back. And I think that was kind of one of for me, the most formative experience, kind of to see what it actually, because we're doing all these contracts and we're saying, oh, then we do a little bit arbitration here, a bit of insurance, what it actually means to go through the whole process before you get the money back. So that was one of the biggest lessons for me, even though a lot of that I didn't do directly any longer. I was already 2 jobs further on, but that also shows the timeline, how long it sometimes takes, even if you have very, very good security mechanism in your contracts, how you enforce them. So that's good lesson for me from an investing perspective, and I think it made me a better investor over time.
We've had one write down so far, and it's in a US CPG company that was really going to take on kind of the promotion of aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture, while selling a product that was really transparent and sustainable from different farms. I actually think we knew it was too early, but we wanted to believe that if we pushed the right levers, we could tip the space into caring more about purchasing and increasing the value of sustainability. And again, it was too early because just systematically we weren't set up for that. Like the retailer didn't really understand their role, the buyer didn't understand their role, the consumer didn't understand their role. Even now with all that's happened, I think a consumer-facing product, getting the consumer to be the one to make the choice, it's still early for that before kind of everything helping the product get there and helping the consumer get there, like the infrastructure or the framework for that, it has been built. I also think, though, and this is in our one, and we still haven't written this off, we're still trying to turn it into something, but in this example, we learned a huge amount about the retail space, about what is possible. It did push the conversation forward. Did it help us get to where we are? Absolutely. Was it a good investment? Not at all.
Was the lesson learned that it was too early for retail? Or was the lesson learned that it was too early for the company?
No, I think it was too early for what the company was doing. And I think like had we still wanted to forge forward with it, it would have meant that would have needed a really ample marketing budget. And I don't think that would have made a great investment, but it would have made the company take off. But that's the problem, right? That economics didn't work out if you wanted to make it what it needed to be.
Yeah, we had an investment in a microbial DNA traceability company that I thought was particularly intriguing. Essentially, they could evaluate the dust and dirt of any given area and use that to give you a unique fingerprint for where something came from. And we thought that that would be a tremendous opportunity to address unauthorized informal outsourcing in supply chains, because often production occurs where someone will take on an order, but they don't have the capacity. They outsource it to somebody down the street, and there's very little regulation. A lot of labor abuse occurs there. Anyway, so we invested in that particular platform. And unfortunately, when COVID hit, they pivoted and tried to respond to using that technology in other ways to address indoor air quality environments. And so went a little bit sideways as a result of that. I continue to think that it was a really unique technology to address a problem that still needs to be addressed. So disappointing in that regard.
Honestly, I haven't had any that I feel that way about yet. And it might be because it's relatively early, right? I guess there could be, if I think about my previous career, I wasn't necessarily the decision maker in all of them, though. There's like one company that the impact was deep, but the business model wasn't. And ultimately, they haven't continued on. And that was unfortunate. It's a company that should exist. And I think it was more the capital structure was wrong. That's probably an unfortunate one from like within my own experience, looking at like, oh, this is great impact. This ticks a lot of boxes. But really, if you would have dug into like, but the business model and the type of finance we're providing isn't truly a match. And in the early days, I think that was happening a lot more because not necessarily just by me, but like in general, because we were looking for like, what does sustainable finance look like with our expectations and impact expectations? But, you know, thinking about maybe ones that got away, there have definitely been a number of them because we had a really small fund. We could only make 12 investments. We made, 12 investments in the companies we were most excited about. It gave us the diversification we needed for Fund 1, but there are definitely probably 5 or 7 that I wish we could have gotten into also. And if we'd only had a larger fund, those ones that got away, but I'm so supportive of and happy that they're doing well. And, it's good to see that.
So I don't mind investing in husband and wife teams, but my failure was in a company that happened to be a husband and wife team. Mm-hmm. And my learning there was you need to make sure that you have clear business roles so that you don't have to rely on marital roles. It was a phenomenal business. The product was definitely needed in the market and it was right timed. And I actually think it's superior to anything that's out there. But the ultimate failure was back to this governance thing. The husband and wife were both on the board. They were both in the executive suite. The consequences to the rest of the organization were profound when their marriage became the relationship of note for the business. And all I mean by that is their marriage ultimately determined the future of the business, and that wasn't successful. They couldn't scale beyond their marriage. Anyone they hired couldn't get into that inner circle. Having said that, we have other husband and wife investments that worked out just fine. It's just that the things were in place, the checks and balances were in place, the business structure was in place so that they could be married and do their independent roles within the business, and others could come into spheres of influence.
This kind of goes to my previous answer. This was a really cool deal in Africa, providing working capital to a small enterprise in the northern rangelands of Kenya to buy cattle from herders who practice better grazing practices to improve wildlife habitat. And we structured a forgivable loan, I can't remember the amount, into this enterprise. And it was a great idea. And all kinds of things happened, including primarily they couldn't get access to markets to sell the beef. I learned the importance of how challenging it is to scale a tiny operation that had been funded by $1 million grant, 5X, in the middle of the remote, rural, highland rangelands of Kenya, the challenges of operating a business in that environment, and how much harder it is than it looks.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.